Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending where in the world you are. I'm Lisa Berkeley, and this is Reaction to Response. We are a series that was designed to help us shift from fear-based reactions to care and compassionate-based responses. And we get the honor of having conversation with thought leaders and grassroots organizers from around the world. So we were birthed through the Charter for Compassion, Women and Girls sector, and we're in over 400 cities with 1,800 partners in 53 countries around the world and divided into 12 sectors. You can learn more at about charterforcompassion.org. This morning, before we get started, I'd like to just do a little bit of housekeeping. First, this call is being recorded. Second, if you have any tech issues, you can go to zoom.us. And then, of course, if you have any questions or comments for our speakers, you can go into the chat section, which is, if you hover at the bottom of your screen, should pop up. Also, I want to thank a few people working with us behind the scenes: Sandy Hart, Brianna Lathorpe, Susan DeGaia, and Betsy Spano. Today, we have two guests, Mayor Greg Fischer and Tom Williams, both of Louisville, Kentucky. Both men have been instrumental in building compassionate Louisville. While Mayor Fischer continues to govern the city with compassion as the undergirding of his platform, Tom has a greater focus today on building compassionate corporate communities through building a strong movement of B Corps. And so with that, I'd like to say welcome Mayor Fischer and Tom. Hold on. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, there is one other thing that I would like to add, which is that today's format, we're going to be a little bit different. We're going to have a 45-minute webinar, and then we're going to switch over to our after party for about 15 minutes, where Mayor Fischer will be able to join us. And then we are going to go on for another half hour or so with Tom Williams. So the link is on your screen. It's also in your chat box. And thank you very much. And here we are. Okay. Good morning. Okay, so thank you very much, Mayor Fischer, for being with us, and Tom for being with us. I'm so excited to have you here. And I think really we can just jump right into our conversation. And starting off a little bit with the background for those who don't know, what does it mean to be a compassionate city? If we can start off in that place.
Well, there's a lot of ways to go at this. I mean, a little bit of background. When I was elected mayor, I'm not a career politician, so I'm an entrepreneur, and I always thought that a organization should be very clear on how it's going to make its decisions. So I said we'd have three guiding values for our city. And the first value was city of lifelong learning. The second was a city of health, physical, mental, environmental, and spiritual health. And the third was to be an even more compassionate city. So it was kind of a dream, if you live in a city where everybody's learning, everybody's healthy, the environment's healthy, and everybody's caring for each other through compassion. So that's a good place to live.
Yeah.
But then the question became, okay, how do you activate something like that? And I think it's important how we define compassion. We define compassion as respect for each and every one of our citizens so that their human potential is flourishing, thriving. Okay, so it's action work. Oftentimes people say, compassion means empathy, and it kind of connotes a hierarchy, of somebody being in a superior spot to feel for somebody, don't we need to help these folks? It's more as a really leaning in to say, no, I respect your human potential. What can I do, and what can I receive in exchange when I do that in terms of helping me expand my ability to be good or to do good? So that's what compassion means to us. And then there's all kind of methods that we use to really bring it into life, because I haven't found anybody to disagree that compassion is a good value for a city. But the question is, how do you bring it to life in a city?
That's a really big piece. And then I know, Tom, you were also involved with Mayor Fischer in helping to get Louisville on the map as a hardcore compassionate city. Do you have anything that you want to add to Mayor Fischer's words?
Yeah, well, when you have a mayor that talks about compassion on a daily basis and has the courage to make it one of his foundational values, it really creates a space where people want to come in and be part of a community that's being built in that manner. And so at Compassionate Louisville, we've been helping as we're able to activate this goal of compassion that Mayor Fischer set forth. And we've set it up as universally positive. So we're really just trying to become a kind of an incubator and an accelerator for compassionate activities. And so a lot of different groups have jumped in. We have over 100 and something businesses that have made a commitment to compassion in a similar vein that the city has made a commitment to compassion. And we have what we call constellations of compassion working in different sectors, such as healthcare or with schools or with education. And so to quote my good friend John Raymer, it's inside out, outside in, bottom up, top down. And I've been a little part of some of the grassroots organizing, but again, when you have an elected official who sees that compassion really is a value that takes strength, because it takes strength to be willing to be vulnerable, to be willing to accept the humanity of whoever is across from you, then you start to create conditions where it can grow. And we've, at Compassionate Louisville, see compassion as an ecosystem. We want people hearing about compassion at school, at work, in the community. And we've been very fortunate to have an anchor project led by the mayor's office through Brenda Frank of a volunteer week that has grown. So it's not ready made for an elevator talk, because it's not a short-term project, it's a long-term project. And I like to tell people, we've planted an oak tree here in Louisville that's a few years old and it could get stepped on. But, if we stick with it in the long term, it'll grow and it'll become foundational for our community.
Got it. So, I think, and I'm going to twist this terribly, so please forgive me. Karen Armstrong talks about a compassionate city being an uncomfortable city. And that you're uncomfortable because you're really looking social challenges right in hardcore in the face and saying, we're going to address these. And I'd love to hear this from both of you. What are some of the biggest challenges that you feel you're facing, and what does it mean to be compassionate when addressing those topics?
Well, compassion, a lot of it is truth-telling. So, when this world that we live in today in the United States of America in particular, there's a lot of challenges we have around social mobility, racism. So, some societies or cities choose not to talk about this stuff, like they think it's going to go away. It only festers and it gets worse if you don't address it. So there's ways that we put compassion to work with methods like Tom mentioned in our school system with our Compassionate Schools Project, or large volunteer weeks. Our Give a Day Week of Service had 180,000 people this past April do that, or at the University of Louisville's medical school, compassion and mindfulness is part of their curriculum. But I see that, when you look at how we define it, respect for each and every citizen so their human potential is flourishing, what gets in the way of that? Social mobility is a huge issue, health inequities, where you're born determining what your destiny is. So, how do you try to break the shackles of poverty or inclusion in a community? So when you take a look at that work, and a lot of the work we're trying to do on the whole child, that is making sure that every kid's got a chance to succeed and starting at the prenatal stage. So when they show up at kindergarten, they're not behind advantaged kids. I look at all of that as equity work, as compassion work. In the post-Charlottesville environment we're in right now, we're having a lot of great dialogue around racism and slavery. A lot of folks, white populations in particular, don't understand that legacy of slavery continues to this day. They think, the Civil War was 150 years ago. Why don't people get over it? So it's important that we understand our history and how it affects us here today, and then what we can do moving forward. So I can tell you, when you have conversations around poverty and lack of mobility, social mobility, and race, that does make people uncomfortable. But that's why it's exciting work. That's why it's good work. If you look at it from an asset lens and see these as inhibitors for people's human potential to flourish, this is the exact kind of work that we need to be doing. And one last point is, we don't want people to look at this kind of work as, win-lose, okay? So if those people, whomever they are, do better, somehow that's going to make me do worse. No, I mean, this is a rising tide lifts all boat. When more people are engaged in a positive way around compassion and economic inclusion, what it does is it makes the whole pie bigger. So everybody's going to benefit as a result of that. And that's a mental frame that a lot of people are still trying to move through.
Do you want to add anything to that, Tom? Or?
Yeah, and I think the mayor's comment about the win-lose is a very good one, because I think compassion as a theme for a community has become a vehicle for people to become more engaged citizens. The idea is that we're not fully a compassionate city till everyone participates, till everyone lives through the benefits of being a more compassionate city. So, the challenges are that we both are a compassionate city and we're not a compassionate city. I mean, I think partly why compassion is here and why compassion is in every community is that there's just so much need, and there's so much pain and suffering. And convincing people to have the courage to try to live a more compassionate life takes time, and it takes often people to see other leaders live that way before they follow up. And I think one of the great assets of this movement right now is all the science that supports that living compassionately is both good for your individual health and communal health. And so consequently, we frame this in terms of this is partly an experiment. We don't know exactly where all this will go, but we trust that if you on your own part try to live more compassionately, it will help the whole and will help the life of the whole community. So there's a tremendous amount of challenges associated with it, but creating this platform for compassion really helps citizens feel engaged to step in. And a good example is, we've had a tremendous number of murders in our community over the last few years, and we have our little Drepung Gomong Center, who hosted the Dalai Lama a few years ago, feel called to remember the people that were murdered. And so they gather in the community center anytime there's a murder, and they call out the name of the murdered individuals, is a form of remembrance and kind of creating a spirit and the conditions that we want to propagate in our community. Because I think compassion is contagious, just like violence is contagious. And so, the mayor, when he started this, said he wanted to create a brush fire of compassion. We understand we can't manage all these things. A lot of what we're doing is trying to inspire people to live from their heart.
Let me add to that, if I could, on compassion and citizenship. So I look at citizenship in three ways. One is you take care of yourself so that you can be a productive human being and do good. Second is take care of the relationship you have with your employer or your employees. So there's value added both ways. But the third is do something for your community for which you expect nothing in return, other than you get to be a citizen of wherever it is that you live. So, the connotation of citizenship in that third bucket is all about compassion, right? That means you care about something bigger than yourself, and that's how you express yourself. It's not something exceptional. It's not something out of the ordinary. It's what you do as a citizen. And the more people can view themselves as, kind and compassionate the people that they are, the better that we will be in a city. So in many ways, what we're doing here is just trying to reawaken these human values that we're all born with. We are born as compassionate beings, as loving beings, kind, hospitable beings. But for some reason, society kind of beats that out of us. So one of the basic jobs of any leader, whether it's a corporate leader, because compassionate companies are the best companies, or government leaders, or us as just individuals, we need to be talking about these human values on a constant basis. So we remind people who we are. Right. We are not born to fight. We are not born to divide. We're interdependent and interconnected. We rely on each other. So let's start with the basic in the heart and soul of who we are. Then we might be able to disagree on other things that are smaller in the big picture. But the human values are where we start.
So you've just, between the two of you, you spurned all kinds of questions. And so what's interesting, though, is what you're talking about really is the individual initiative. And so I'm wondering about policy and how this touches into policy and how much, the gap between grassroots movements and policymaking. So are you actually able to write this in policy, or it's just more from person to person?
Well, and let me jump in on just one aspect of that, and that is the mayor triggered some work I'm doing with public benefits, because, you know, the citizenship, being a citizen, is that you give for the sake of giving. You know, the idea of a public benefit corporation, which is policy in Kentucky now, it's legal for businesses to do that as of this summer. You know, it's an opportunity to measure and to be more intending back aspect that you know, a business, but creating an infrastructure where businesses can be more intentional about measuring not only their financial return, but their return on community investment, I think is very helpful.
Mm-hmm.
So
the mayor obviously is going to be more policy issues than I am.
Yeah, well, Tom's been one of the leaders in our community on restorative justice. So that's a perfect example of how you can work within the criminal justice system in a more compassionate manner. And there's lots of great science and results around that we see in our city as well. But you can also then take on other issues, like how do you take on our education system to make sure that it's a more compassionate system relative to human potential flourishing. So we've done that with our Compassionate Schools project. We have the largest project like this going on anywhere in the world. 25 different of our elementary schools have integrated a curriculum based on compassion. So it's nutrition and wellness, social and emotional learning, and then mindfulness. And it was directed at our youngest kids because of what Tom indicated earlier about the neurological developments that can come from mindfulness and compassion. It really helps close the gap between advantaged kids that are showing up 3 years ahead of disadvantaged kids at the age of 6. So we're trying to have disruption in terms of how kids can learn to close those gaps and to give them a better shot basically in life, to produce an open mind and an open heart through the Compassionate Schools project. And then we're extending our breadth of work that we're doing in education by focusing on whole child development. You know, when you think about the results we're getting with our education system in our country right now, we are not competitive. I mean, we're like number 30 in the world. Our education system is designed for an economy that's 50 years old, and today's world economy is rapidly moving. It's global. We have non-traditional family structures, but we have not changed the core of our education system. So what we're doing here is developing and focusing on the whole child. Mm-hmm. So making sure that physical and mental health needs are taken, the social and emotional learning needs are taking, so that they progress all the way through that. And as a society, we mature beyond asking how a child's doing in school to wondering about what test results are, to thinking about that whole child from a physical and mental and a spiritual standpoint as well. So I wish that work was happening at the federal level and state levels, but it's not. So the mayors of the country are innovating from the ground up, and hopefully we can demonstrate how much better results we're getting as a result of this type of work. And we've also institutionalized a lot of this work in our equity office here. So there's a few cities out there now that have chief equity officers that are looking at areas where there have been, vastly disproportionate results, and ask, why are the results happening the way they are, so that we try to get everybody on a platform where they're resourced properly, where their human potential can flourish. So we don't call that, compassion work, but to me, it all ties into being a compassionate city.
Oh, that's a lot there, and that's very, very rich and powerful. A couple of things. We're getting some questions from our audience, and so Terry Alling says, Mayor Gregg, can you speak about the role of police service, if any, in Compassionate Louisville?
Yes, it's a great point there. It's a really dynamic time in policing in the country right now. So, we have what we call a people-place strategy with public safety, but you can't look at policing alone, right? Policing is the enforcement of law. Mm-hmm. But what are all of the other aspects that go into enforcement? Is kind of at the end of a system that should be about building human capacity so that you don't really have difficulty in a community. There's always going to be some people that decide to go down a life of crime. As Tom spoke out, for the first second 5 months this year, we had a significant increase in homicides in our community, driven by drugs and guns and gangs. But we've been working in this area for quite some time. So from a people strategy, you have the enforcement side. In any city, you're going to have a small number of people that create about 2/3 of the mayhem, regardless of where you go. So you got to know who those folks are. You're trying to interrupt them so that you can have a peaceful city. But then there are thousands of folks, and it's usually young men, that you're trying to interact with to build their capacity and give them hope about being part of a connected society so they don't go down a life of crime. So that's our Office for Safe and Healthy Neighborhoods. So we have a process called Safe Stat, so safe statistics, that approaches this project from enforcement, capacity building, reentry, so that we're looking at this whole system of A, keeping people out of trouble, but B, if they're in it, then reintegrating them so that they can be productive on the other side. So it's policing that looks at society in a more holistic fashion and making sure we're providing the right resources at the right time. So we're doing a lot of interesting experiments in this area and seeing some great results. Just one I'll mention is a program called Reimage. Reimage is for young folks aged 16 to 24 that have been involved with our justice system in some way. And what you see in most of these folks is they have not had an adult that's engaged with them in a loving manner that provides expectations, some structure, and some accountability or discipline. Through our Reimage program, we've now worked with 250 kids, and our recidivism rate is 5%. Okay, so when people tell you these programs don't work, they do work. You just need to have to resource them intelligently and work with the right folks.
Oh, you touch on a really interesting thing around prison systems, but I'm gonna, before we jump down that road, there are a few more questions coming in, which I want to address, but I also, I'm curious, and I'm gonna put them on the screen. I don't know how familiar you are with the U.S. sustainability goals. I'm gonna put this down here. They're now on your screen, and I'm wondering, if you're familiar with them and if they played a part in the undergirdings of establishing Louisville as a compassionate city.
Yeah, let me speak to that just a second. Not intentionally. I think intuitively these were part of what was going on. One thing that we've had in process that's not landed yet, that was developed at the University of Louisville, is a Compassionate Cities Index, which would measure some of these metrics and give us potentially a snapshot, both with individual surveys and with global metrics built on this type of infrastructure, intellectual infrastructure. So there's been some work on that that's not ready for public consumption yet, but I think these are all goals that everyone can agree on.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting too, because Mayor Fischer, when you speak about really helping individuals reach their highest potential, that certainly touches on a lot of these goals, if not all of them. And so, I wanted to put them up because this is actually something we talk about a lot through the Reaction to Response series, is how is the Charter for Compassion able to support the implementation of these 17 sustainability goals? And so I do like to...
Fantastic. Yeah. And what's fantastic about these is, if you're just talking about issues like compassion, love, kindness, and you don't have methods to mobilize and move forward and make those human values relatable, that have tangible outcomes, you're not doing everything you can do, right? Because these are all deeply personal effects that come out of human values. And so the Sustainable Development Goals, these are all embedded one way or another in different work that we do in our community. So the issue is with this, a lot of these things is you just got to get started. And I get that from mayors around the world quite a bit, is, okay, how do you do it? And I said, well, find an area that you're passionate about. And it could be in the environment, it could be health equity, and then just drill down on that, on this lens of compassion. And something good's going to happen. There's no one perfect way to start, but the key thing is to get started.
You're making me laugh because I can hear my parents' voice in my head from when I was growing up, feeling overwhelmed on things, and them just saying, just start, and the rest will fall into place. And I think because we are both...
Well, so many of these challenges are so big, but they all have one thing in common. Practically is the only way to solve them is one person at a time. So it has to be that person on one side saying, you know what, I'm going to get involved. I'm going to try to help some way. I'm going to reach out to this person. I'm going to do this volunteer work. But if it doesn't start with that one person, it's never going to go. So you got to take all these big problems on one person at a time and then try to scale it up, that brush fire of compassion that Tom mentioned at the beginning of the interview. And our job as leaders, and I think everybody's a leader. It doesn't have to be an elected official or folks like you all and people listening in. Everybody can do something, right? And there's nothing holding you back.
That's so interesting. So I just need to make a little bit of a correction. I think I made a mistake and said U.S. Sustainability goals. I meant UN for the United Nations sustainability goals. And to your point about everybody being able to do something, in one of our previous calls, the idea, and I'm going to share screen one last time here, came up about the role of the individual and the need really for what we're calling SDG +1 or SDG 18, the unofficial sustainable goal, which would be self-awareness and personal agency, so that we really recognize that both as individuals and civil society, that we can step up and make a change. But also, sort of to your point, I think inviting city officials as well to look at their heart, their mind, and what are their biases, and how do they also implement care and compassion as a leader.
Yeah, and let me jump in on just one observation of being outside of the political process and just helping with grassroots. Having watched mayors interact with each other gives me a lot of reason to hope. I mean, when you watch the news, you see dysfunction at the state and federal level in the United States. But my observation is that mayors touch their constituency, they talk to each other, they have healthy competitions with each other, they want to see each other succeed. And so, I think every city sees itself as something of a laboratory to try things out. And so, these mayors are really public servants, and there's exceptions to every rule, but the mayors that Mayor Fischer are talking about don't see it as a zero-sum game. They see it as a both-and proposition. Louisville and Lexington can succeed, and I think that gives me a lot of reason to hope to see a very healthy political process going on.
So, Lisa, some of the things you're talking about here, bringing the question of what it means to be wealthy. In the American frame, it's usually about financial wealth, but that is just one part of a much bigger puzzle that we have to look at and consider when we're developing our cities and developing our country as well. Financially, the United States of America is the wealthiest country on the face of the earth. So for us to have the inequities that we have and the inequalities that we have, those are conscious decisions that are the result of systems that have been put in place in our country. And for people not to understand kind of the systemic nature of this and our ability to change it as well. If we redefine what wealth means, in terms of opportunity for everybody, certainly accountability for everybody, but a healthy environment, a healthcare system that works for everybody. All of this conversation about healthcare in the country these last several months has been focused on the wrong issue. When you take a look around at the world and you see other companies spending half as much as we do on healthcare and getting better healthcare results and longer life, that's what we should be talking about as a country in terms of building wealth and health as an example. So I just, I'm trying to get people to think when they say wealth, it's not just money, okay? Because money's not working right now in our country for a lot of people. In our middle class is shrinking, our poor increasing, while the country theoretically is getting wealthier at the same time. We got to change how we're looking at that, and compassion is part of that. That doesn't mean you're a socialist. That doesn't mean you're some far left-wing liberal. It means that you respect people where you think that they should have the chance for their human potential to flourish. And guess what happens when that takes place? The economy gets bigger. It's good for everybody.
Also, you've just touched on one of the questions. Someone says, can either Mayor Greg or Tom speak about how do you sell a compassionate city from an economic standpoint, particularly when the resources are so scarce and the issues and challenges are so vast?
Well, and Mayor Fischer might be able to speak better to this than I can, but Mayor in our city have attracted prosperous businesses, partly because they like this theme of compassion. They want to bring their employees to a city that has a value and is trying to live out a value like compassion. So there's a lot of economic incentives that come with it. And I think another thing that Mayor Fischer says so well is, this platform is calling out citizens to be engaged. The volunteer week, there's a huge economic impact to a volunteer week that doesn't cost city government anything, and it is encouraging people to meet needs when they see needs. So, we don't have a lot of metrics on it, but we know from watching that it helps create a more prosperous community.
Mm-hmm.
Well, just 2 points on that. I mean, if you accept the definition of compassion as being respect for people so their human potential is flourishing, and I can tell you from a business person's perspective, it's been my whole life.
Mm-hmm.
We manage and led our businesses around this value of compassion as well. And with the platform for the business being a platform for human potential to be flourish, okay?
Mm-hmm.
So we've just expanded that into the city. So if you have a company where you're training people, not just for them to do a better job in the workplace, but training their ability to enhance their human capacity beyond the workplace with problem-solving skills and project management skills, those are values and abilities they take into the community that make their families better and their neighborhoods better as well. So if you have a company like that, guess what? You're going to be the best company in your industry. Right. And if you're competing against people that don't believe in their employees' full human potential flourishing, you beat them all day long. So this is good for business. Let me give you a specific example. One of our large economic development wins 2 years ago was with a company called ComputerShare. Mm-hmm. And we were competing with 40 other cities as ComputerShare was consolidating a bunch of their locations. We ended up being the city that they've moved to. And about 3 months afterward, I asked the CEO, I said, all these cities, and we're delighted that you all are here, but why did you select our city? Yeah. And he said, looked at me right in the eye, and he said, I loved your city's focus on compassion.
Oh, you give me goosebumps.
Good for business.
Yeah, wow, you give me real goosebumps on that. That's very powerful. So it's interesting because there are a number of questions that are coming in that I'm going to sort of summarize because they're more or less related. When they're asking a little bit more for you to speak about how do you become a compassionate city? And you've mentioned like just to jump in and start to do that, but how do you implement it in policy, and how do you convince how do you get buy-in from city council? And also in that vein, one of the two questions keep coming up about what is it that called you as a mayor to try this social experiment, basically?
Well, we start on the first thing, Tom, when you led us with the signing of the charter in 11/11/11, if you want to talk about that process, and I'll talk about some other.
Sure, and I've talked to 40-something cities that have gotten started, and Mayor, I don't know if I've not told you, but I've heard that Lexington, Kentucky is going to sign on as a compassionate city on Thursday, and we've been talking to them for a long time about this. But, I tell every city's a compassionate city. I mean, every city has a storyline around which you build compassion. Toledo, Ohio, I went up and met with them, and they talked about after 9/11, some of the Muslim people in the community were being threatened, and they built a human chain around their mosque, which is on I-75 and visible. So what I tell cities is, to use John Raymer's advice of bottom up, top down, inside out, outside in, you kind of get started. You start to find people who are passionate for the work, and then you start having conversations, and you're patient, and you ask other compassionate cities to help you. I mean, we've had a number of delegations come in here to see what a compassionate city looks like. We've sent delegations from Louisville to other cities to help them talk about this conversation of what it means to be a compassionate city. But what we've seen is cities have this preliminary conversation, and then they make a public commitment to compassion through their metro council or their mayor, and then they start to do the work after that. And some cities have focused on particular things. Some have worked in a number of different sectors. And the Charter for Compassion in Marilyn Turkovich has a toolbox that's helpful. So there's a lot of resources out there to help, and we've helped as we've been able to help. And I don't know if that answers your question.
And I start at the level of, why does a city exist? I mentioned this earlier. To me, a city is a platform for human potential to flourish, right? In all of its multitude of ways. So often people think kind of at the tactical level, well, we need to be a safe city, which we certainly need to do. We need to be a healthy city. No question about that. But if we're not jumping up and seeing us integrated, combined together, connected around these human values that I spoke about, then we're not starting at a solid foundation. So when you start talking about this in a city, and it certainly happened to us here, people say, oh, that seems kind of weird. Compassion is soft. You're supposed to be some strong politician. And what I said, look, it's more difficult for most people to be compassionate and really get involved with people that they don't know to help them than it is to be a cynic from the couch or always angry. I mean, we see that in the public discourse right now. So it's kind of important to claim the space and what you're trying to do and be unapologetic about it. I mean, I reject attempts at dividing our city by race, by religion. You are never going to win the game, metaphorically speaking, of economic inclusion or opportunity creation for your city if people are pitted against each other. Now, we might be different and we might have a hard time understanding each other, but that's where we should work, right? Not pulling each other apart. And obviously, our national dialogue is really infected by this problem right now. So you start by claiming the space, reminding people who we are, the goodness inside each and every one of us, and then say, we're going to work on that. And it might be a little uncomfortable for some folks, but not for long. People like to jump in. Most people claim they're affiliated with some religious tradition too. At the heart of every religious tradition is the notion of compassion or the golden rule. So, we can bring people in through that lens also. But then you got to have the methods that I've, talked about quite a bit here during this broadcast. Otherwise, it's just like, well, it sounds nice and it's soft and touchy, but what are you doing?
Right. So, oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, and from my standpoint on building a compassionate city, I've not spent any time attacking anyone or anything. I mean, my thinking is that you build what you want to see, and if the other institutions don't work, they'll fall away. So we've been very intentional about being universally positive and not, as the mayor put it, pitting citizens against other citizens, but try to build a more compassionate world, which in my view includes things like restorative justice, includes things like B Corps, includes things like institutions committed to compassion, includes individual training, includes community training, includes the compassion becomes something that people are very comfortable talking about and and are willing to struggle with it. And part of why I like compassion so much as a goal is that it asks something of me. I mean, I have to commit to it every day. I'm not setting up an issue that doesn't ask anything of me, that puts a burden on someone else. These are challenges that we all face as individuals on a daily basis, and we all we flourish when we practice compassion. And so helping others practice it is going to be nothing but positive.
So you remind me when you mentioned also earlier B Corp that a man by the name of John Montgomery, who is one of the big initiators of the B Corp movement in California and really getting it as a legitimate law, said to me, part of the problem is that when, people live a compassionate life as individuals, but then they step into the boardroom or the governmental office or whatever, and they leave their compassion or the golden rule at the door. And I really hear you both obviously talking about not doing that. And so the question then comes into play. So is compassion written into your city plan? And then with that, when you, Mayor Fischer, when you spoke about bringing this corporation to relocate to your city, was there a, and maybe I'm getting too specific here, but was there a clause or something along those lines that not only had the corporation say, oh, I like that you're focused on compassion, but was there some agreement that they would get involved as participating in that compassionate movement? And let me sort of put a caveat. I'm asking this from the context of mayors, for example, whose cities are developing and they're trying to bring business in, and that balance between the two.
Well, they're totally complementary. So first, yes, the charter is, we've signed the International Charter for Compassion. Compassion is one of our city goals, and we've got action plans around that as well, so that it's a big part of who we do and what we are. And then our business community is involved with our compassion efforts as well. The company that I focused on, they're very engaged in our philanthropic and volunteer community. They're very proud about that. They use that as a distinction for their company in terms of recruiting and getting people involved with the city. And then other companies see that as well. So if you came to Louisville and talked to people about compassion, they wouldn't think you're weird. Okay, they would think we've got a context for this within our city. And I can tell you, year one, maybe year two, Tom, a little bit, people took a little bit getting used to it, but we use the word unapologetically and have all kind of activities around it and methods for people to advance in this area, whether it be the business sector or nonprofits, foundations, certainly government.
And I would add to that, you know, early on when people would raise maybe publicly, does X, Y, or Z happen in a compassionate city? They'd ask me, does that cause a problem for you? And I'd say no, because now there's a tension between who we are and who we want to be. And asking, you know, we didn't have a goal like that before. And the only way we can grow into a goal like that is when people feel the tension between, you know, me hitting the mark and missing the mark on being a compassionate city. So I think these kinds of dialogues and people saying, you know, do certain things happen in a compassionate city is exactly what we want.
Got it. So, because I know Mayor Fischer, you are on very limited time. We have a little bit more than 15 minutes left here. And originally what we do is we have this platform and then we switch to what we're calling the reaction to response after party, where people can engage. But we're having so many questions come through this way. I think we're going to just continue in this format. The question came in from Laura Burgess. Can you give us an update on the metrics we've heard about that you are creating to measure the ROI of compassion in action? That you're creating to measure the ROI of compassionate action in cities. Sorry, was that clear?
And I can give an update on that. The folks at University of Louisville, Dr. Joe D'Ambrosia and Anna Fall, have developed a survey to send to a certain number of individuals, and they were trying to get a certain number of people in each zip code, so it's representative of the whole community. And then they also worked with the Happiness Index in Bhutan and some other indexes, and they've developed it. It is not ready to launch publicly, and you know, they've got a full-time day job working on the Center for Optimal Aging, which is another big part of being a compassionate city. So it's not ready to release, but I can check in with them and follow up as appropriate.
That would be great. I'm sure our audience would love to hear that. And along these same lines, unless Mayor Fischer, did you want to add anything to that, or?
No, last week we had a meeting, I know, here in the city with some folks from Santa Monica, California, that won a Bloomberg Innovation Grant around creating a city wellness index. So I think there was some sharing of information about what we're doing with the Compassionate Cities Index with what they were doing. I was not part of those meetings, but I understand they were here. So that's a good thing. So we can develop a tool to scale throughout the world.
Great. Hold on. This is from Zoe Muntner. The Compassionate Index is a partnership with Louisville Metro Government, the University of Louisville School of Medicine, the International Charter of Compassionate Cities, Compassionate Louisville, and the International Charter for Compassion. How is this different from other indexes, and who do you share your information with? Oh, that's a really long. I
can't really speak to how it's different. The folks who developed the index would be best positioned to talk about that. They're drawing from a lot of different tools.
Got it. So both of you have indicated that cities are interested in following this path, and the question comes up is, have other cities chosen? You've been a role model for other cities. And the question, she says, is, however, Louisville, as a catalyst for the Compassionate Cities movement, didn't have a model. So where did you start, and what was your initial focal point? Okay.
Well,
so
our city's got a,
but yeah, go ahead.
Our city's got a strong tradition of around compassion, I believe. Thomas Epiphany was here in 1958. We're the home of Muhammad Ali, who, was the world's greatest athlete in the 20th century, but he used that platform to become the biggest badass humanitarian of all time as well. And then we're home for the Center for Interfaith Relations here, and they're in their 22nd year for their world-known Festival of Faiths. It's a global gathering of interfaith leaders and discussion. So, it's part of the roots and the soul of who we are as a city. And then I was fortunate to have, a really great mom who, her value was, if you can help somebody, you help them. Don't ask what's in it for you. So when I was inaugurated, I said, let's do a big day of service and honor my mom. And that led to this whole Give a Day week of service. So service is the easiest way to start. Everybody gets that. So how do you institutionalize it and scale it and get your school systems and your churches involved and kind of create that as part of the tradition of our city? We integrated that week with the Kentucky Derby Festival, which is a 2-week festival for a 2-minute horse race. But the week before that is Give a Day, and we put it there because we wanted to have a race for compassion. A dream would be that every city is competing with each other, to see who can be the most compassionate city and have the most acts of compassion and volunteership. And for us to be reading about that in the newspaper instead of some of the other garbage that we see on a day basis. So, that was the easiest way to start. It was much more difficult to get a Compassionate Schools project going in terms of curriculum, integrating that, much more involved. The work that Tom's done on restorative justice has been, I guess, difficult starting, but great momentum once it gets going. So there's easy ways to start, volunteership, but then developing these deeper methods take a little bit more time, but just keep with it.
Right on. Excellent. So we've got like another 10 minutes left. And so I guess my question for both of you before you depart is, what's on your heart? What's on your heart and soul, both the biggest challenges and the thing that just makes you sing? I mean, aside from the obvious spreading compassion, like what projects now?
Well, I can start with that. In just an observation that, so much of life involves, what you see on the news involves what you might call vicious cycles, where one bad act leads to another bad act and kind of create this contagious challenges. My experience with compassion is that it creates cycles where you plant a little seed and you don't have to manage it and it grows on its own. And so we've seen so many examples of the universe being friendly to this endeavor because it's really calling out a very generative energy that exists. And I think, the mayor's right. This is our community at its best. And, we have our days where we're not living up to it. But I think, the way we've tried to position this is that people should go to work for compassion, that she's a good one to work for, that this is not an R or a D project. This is a community project. This is a human project. And so I'm just so incredibly grateful for the opportunity to see what compassion, a topic like that, can do for a community. And the thing I'm working on extensively right now is this public benefit corporation project. And we just had a nice meeting on Friday with some leaders from Eastern Kentucky, and they talked about how they're visiting out in California and Portland and some of these Seattle and some other cities, and that they're saying that we have need in Kentucky. And so you have social entrepreneurs, this is a good place to relocate to. So I think, those are the things I'm working on. I'm in my day job. I'm an attorney, and I'm involved in some very challenging legal issues right now. So I can't speak to those, but that's an opportunity to practice compassion as well.
Mm-hmm.
And compassion ultimately is about creating opportunity for people's potential to flourish. So, I'm in a position where hopefully I can create a lot of opportunity on the area of economic inclusion in particular. That's an area that I just feel really deeply about, that, our country has got to get its act together in terms of building a strong middle class and helping to move people out of poverty. And we've had good results in both of those areas here locally. That gives people hope, for a more positive future that spreads to their kids. And we should be a country of enthusiasm and a positive attitude about what the future holds. And there's nothing holding us back but ourselves. Mm-hmm. So there's economic opportunities, but there's also, I think Tom maybe referenced this, there's opportunities of the heart when you're working in this area where you see people some people are drawn to it naturally, But then other folks that have been around it, it's like a light bulb has gone off, and it's opened up a new part of whom they are and ultimately whom they wanted to be. But they need an environment to come around to practice this kind of work and see that it is the natural way. So working in this space, it gives you a lot of opportunity to experience that, and then to see those people go on and create their own version of building opportunity and compassion. And this work is a lot bigger than Tom Williams and myself. Where, I don't know how it is with you, Tom, but you hear about all these different things going on in different parts of the community that I certainly had nothing to do with. Yeah. But it's neat to see it generating itself, and it's just like a snowball going downhill, getting bigger by itself. That's ultimately what we want to see.
Okay, hold on 1 minute. I've lost you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm sorry. Okay, so both of you have touched on something very, very powerful. And there's also some reference going on in the chat as well about how do we help corporations shift from an economic and jobs creation priority to a compassion. In other words, some larger corporations maybe define compassion as providing jobs and income. How do we shift that so that it really becomes a more inclusive, care-based perspective here? And how do we do this without having our hearts totally broken?
Well, as I said earlier, I mean, it's the same work.
Building
a compassionate company is how you maximize your competitiveness. So I guess if a C-suite, a CEO doesn't understand that, then some training needs to take place, or they need to get beat by a compassionate company, so they'll wake up and say, what is it that's in the spirit of that other company that allows them to provide better service, better products at a better cost? So much of corporate life, whether it's America or any country, there's so much waste and de-optimization. And I mean, that was my life for 30 years as an entrepreneur. And when you remove waste, what you do is you increase human potential, okay? And you remove waste by making people more powerful, not just at the workplace with their jobs, but their capacity to see things that they didn't see before through that training. So if a company doesn't see that, that's a fundamental starting point problem we've got. Okay, so being a compassionate company does not mean that you're going to be less competitive. It doesn't mean that you can have less return to your stakeholders. Now, I do think this is an important distinction to make. Mm-hmm. If your only purpose for a company is to maximally optimize the use of capital, mm-hmm. we have a conflict there. Okay, that's a very narrow view of wealth. Mm-hmm. The broader view, and certainly our country used to be better with this, was the purpose of a corporation is to have a great return to their shareholders, but also the employees and the community and their suppliers and the environment. And those are the companies that are going to have long-lasting sustainability. And it's that type of future that's important. And I'll just close by saying, I think when, for instance, when America pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord, you saw a vicious backlash from companies, let's just say Fortune 500 in particular. Why? Because when you talk to those CEOs, they will say, our employees, in particular, our young employees, will not allow us to be environmentally irresponsible.
Right on.
Okay? So if the employees, the work base of our country, and especially the young, talented millennials, are focused more on a balanced wealth future, then that is one way to change this conversation. So if the C-suite's out of touch with reality, the workforce and the talent can bring them in touch with reality if they expect to maintain that very talented and young workforce.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Right on. So there's some comment here. There's two things. First was came from Sandy Hart, who's the director of the Women and Girls sector for Charter for Compassion, and she's saying to me, remember that Mayor Fischer was the first to say that he works for Lady Compassion. And then, so just to acknowledge that as well. Oh, I'm sorry. It wasn't you. It was Tom. I'm sorry. My mistake. I'm sorry.
But I work for Tom, so that's okay.
Yeah, that was that was my borrowing from St. Francis.
Yeah.
But I think, to the mayor's point on what's enough, and this being the women and girls sector conversation, I heard a local woman say that she was in South America and heard from an indigenous leader a female indigenous leader who looked at this woman and said, the trouble in the United States is you women don't lead. And she goes, well, what do you mean by that? And she goes, women lead by saying enough is enough. It's time to come home, honey. And the kind of the way she explained it was, men went out and killed all the buffalo and let the carcasses rot. The women need to say, you don't just, there's enough money. There's enough. We don't measure wealth in the Mayor Fisher's terms just in financial, it's also in well-being and being able to share and have the opportunity to share, and the recognition that, if I'm successful and you're starving, then is that really success? So finding new ways to measure success.
Right. Right on. You remind me also of a lot of Rianne Eisler's work and building a caring economy, where she's talking about shifting from domination systems to care-based systems, and what does that look like, and changing the real wealth of nations as well. So there have been a couple of questions too around Mayor Fischer. You've been such a leader and have had a pretty significant impact on society. Do we get to see more of you on a larger stage? In other words, do you have more political ambitions? But that may be.
Oh, well, I am ambitious to do more good. I'm running for a third term for mayor next year. And it's interesting in this business of politics. I'm relatively new to it, but a lot of people, like, they've been running for class president since like they were 8 years old. And they got this whole plan to dominate the world in some way, and I'm not that way. It's a great city. I think you can be very effective as a mayor to have a platform for change. But if a door opened up and my heart was in it, I would probably go through it. But certainly I've got one more term to serve here as mayor. But our country is in need of a major transformation, especially around these ideas that I've spoken about here today, around what wealth is and around everybody being along for the ride. We're at an exciting time of what the American dream is, okay? And the American dream worked out for a lot of people really well in the post-World War II environment. Now, specifically Caucasians, okay? It didn't work out so well for our people of color. In the world that we're in right now, where we're leaning into issues around race, inclusion, immigration, that's an exciting time for us, because if we get it right, and if we get also issues right around people that are mentally ill or addicted that are not included in the broader society, we can really demonstrate to the world how you can balance inclusion, entrepreneurship, decent living, decent retirement for everybody in a big, big, diverse country. And nobody's been able to demonstrate that right now. And I think that's the opportunity for the United States of America.
I know.
I think mayors will be a big part of that discussion and hopefully solution.
Right on. Excellent. Well, I really, really thank you for your time. I know, Mayor Fischer, that you need to get going. Tom, will you be staying on with us here, or would you like to switch to the other platform?
I actually don't have any help to switch me to the other platform.
So we're going to stay on this platform now. And Mayor Fischer, thank you so much for your time. And I'm sorry that I don't live in Louisville, so I can vote for you for your next term.
Well, I'll just ask everybody to move to Louisville. We'd love to have you.
Okay. Thanks, Lisa. Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks.
Thanks, Mayor.
Okay. Yeah. So Tom, so let's talk a little bit more about, I know that you were very foundational in getting the compassionate movement sort of off the ground. Obviously, Mayor Fischer led the way through governance, but from some of what I've understood from your work, there's been a lot, you've been really involved in both the grassroots movement as well as helping other mayors start themselves as compassionate cities. So can you talk a little bit more about your experience with that?
Yeah. So the story was that Mayor Fischer made compassion one of his foundational themes of his administration in his inaugural address. It was a cold day in January, and nobody really knew that he was going to make compassion a foundational theme. And he didn't know, and he's confirmed this for me, he didn't know there was a global compassion movement that was ongoing when he made it a theme. So, you know, the way I lead is I often try to look, if it's my agenda, it's not going to work. If it's a bigger agenda, you know, the universe's agenda, so to speak, then let me get in the stream of things and try to be helpful where I can be helpful. So I went to the mayor's office and I got a meeting with him and said, you know, essentially there's this charter for compassion out here, and they've posted your inaugural address on the website, and there's this Compassionate Cities movement. What would you think about getting involved? And he said he would, that sounds great. And since I suggested it, I got to lead it. And people here in town have likened it to Kennedy saying he's going to the moon in the beginning of, you know, the 60s, but having no idea actually how they're going to get to the moon. And that's really, you know, how we've worked is we have a big goal that we hope is a laudable goal, and we try to work with people who show up. We didn't ask the mayor to appoint a blue ribbonship of the most prominent people in town who didn't have heart for it. We really worked, you know, when people showed up with heart and interest for the topic, we tried to figure out ways to plug them in. And so we've had some community engagement experts work with us. And as part of that process, we set up what we call the constellation process. So, you know, we had a lady interested in healthcare and compassion, and we helped her lead in that sector. And she brought in Robin Youngson from, you know, New Zealand for 3 different visits to talk about making compassion the driving force for healthcare in our community. And we've also been very intentional about keeping good questions in front of us. And so the driving question for Compassion at Louisville from the very beginning was, what does compassion want for Louisville? And we want every person to answer that question, because the question is different depending upon where you're oriented, but it's a question that each of us can struggle with and grapple with. And so, you know, we ended up having the leaders from the Charter for Compassion make 3 different visits to Louisville before we signed off on the charter. So they came in and we started conversations in our community, and their feedback and mirroring to us was that we already were a compassionate city. So making a public commitment to it would be an affirmation of who we are. And I would say from my experience in talking to other cities that every city is a compassionate city. You know, what's shown on the news is the bad news often, but there's so much good news going on, and we're swimming in compassion, and we just need help and eyes to see it. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you know, so then our city made a public commitment, and it was just a serendipity, but it went to our Metro Council on a Thursday and was going to Mayor Fischer on Friday, and the date that it went to Mayor Fischer was 11/11/11. And so since it was such a good date, we asked him to sign the charter in front of an Abraham Lincoln that was placed in our riverfront, and that none of our elected officials has really used as a backdrop. And so when we declared ourselves a compassionate city, you know, Mayor Fischer said, wouldn't the world be a better place if we competed around good deeds? And my comment was that, you know, that this isn't a 1-year project, this is a 100-year project. I mean, this is not something that we're going to fix in a quarter. This is something that we're going to do over a longer term. So since then, so many people have been involved in every city we've spoken with, at least that I've spoken with. I've said, anything that we have is yours. Anything we've learned, we'll give to you. And we've learned so much from Seattle, from St. Augustine, from San Antonio, from all the cities. And I think that, you know, the thought is that these network of compassionate cities are going to try to do things differently, where we don't see that it's Louisville versus another city. It's that none of us are successful unless the whole network of cities is successful. And that what we want is cities to do it much better than we do. And there are a lot of cities that are doing it much better than we are in certain sectors. We're doing it well in some sectors, and other sectors we're not doing it so well. And so the hope is that as this grows, at some point cities will be able to, you know, exchange ideas and really work with each other in a using compassion as a thing. And sorry for my monologue. If you push my button, sometimes it just spews.
No monologue. There's no monologue here. It's actually a lot of wisdom, and speaks to a lot of other questions too, as far as getting buy-in from city council. You made a very strong, or you caught my attention very deeply when you said, not asking what can we do that is compassionate, but what would compassion do?
Yeah.
And that's a subtle but profound difference in how you look at the question. Not, what would compassion do?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And so how I've tried to frame it from the very beginning is that I don't work for Mayor Fischer. I mean, I'm a volunteer.
Mhm.
I work for Compassion, and he works for Compassion too. And that's where I've kind of gotten the talking point of Lady Compassion, that I treat her as a client and I try to give her priority. And she gives me, what everybody experiences when you get into this space is that you receive so much more than you give, right? I mean, it's the reverse mission. You go out to help, but but you're the one who's helped. So when I talk about compassion to other cities, I say, one, we're not Republican or Democrat, we're human, and we want to go to work. If you're called to work for Compassion, go to work for Compassion. She'll heal you. She'll make you happy. She'll challenge you. She'll help you grow, which is painful. You'll see that goodness is its own reward, that you don't have the hidden agendas maybe that you used to have when you were, so you'll get a lot out of it.
Can I?
That they're part of something that maybe is a divisive thing. But then the other piece is, to make this safe for Mayor Fischer, I said that we're universally positive. We're under the compassion umbrella. We're not going to come out against things. We're going to be this incubator and accelerator for compassion. And, I met with our Archbishop. Some archbishops from other cities have called him about, what do you think about this Compassionate Louisville effort? Would you endorse it? And leaders in his role get worried that there's some hidden agenda that'll preempt what really you're talking about. So what I found is, and not every city does it this way, this is just how Louisville's done it, but that what we need is a group that can help convene different groups, that there's so many groups that advocate for issues, which you need those. I'm not saying you don't need groups to advocate for issues, but you also need a safe place where people from completely different places can come together. And so, we've tried to be an effort where the CEO can meet with the street organizer, and that they can see the humanity in each other, and recognize that, none of us have a complete corner on the truth. We all maybe have some piece of it, and all of us are part of the problem in some ways, and all of us are part of the solution in some ways. And so, how do we help bring out the best in each other? And so we've created our Compassionate Louisville as this safe place that's universally positive, and that is trying to be promotional of compassion. Like I said, though, not every city has kind of followed our suggestion on that.
Mm-hmm. So I just need to take a pause for a moment.
Yeah.
Because I am so touched by you right now. Because you just exhibited, to me anyway, what it means to live compassionately. Because you were just allowed us to see your vulnerability and your courage in being vulnerable as a person who has chosen to live a life of surrender to compassion. And to your point, that's very difficult. It will challenge you. It will make you grow. But your humility and your vulnerability and letting us see you become emotional and even tear up, that to me is that's yes. That's what we're inviting people to do in living the life of compassion and helping to build cities of compassion. It means we have to drop our masks. It means we have to drop all of the things that make us forget. Now you get me emotional. All the things that make us forget who we are.
Yeah.
And so it goes around. And to the point of heart going to heart and interconnecting through hearts, that when we have the courage to start to got very contagious. But that's also the purpose of what we're doing here, is to help one another remember our hearts, remember what it means to live to live compassionately. And I think that you all are just doing phenomenal work, and to drop the or to remember that we're all in this together collectively, and helping people remember that. I'm going to jump because there's all kinds of flashing lights going on with comments. Let's see.
And let me just comment on that too, because I think I was given a wonderful gift from a spiritual director, because I had a kind of life transformation 10 years ago where I saw all my darkness and was really wanting to do things differently. And I was crying all the time. And I went to him and I said, what's up with this? Me crying all the time. And he did me this great favor, because being a man in our Western culture, we're taught very young, as young boys, that crying is not okay. But what he did was kind of completely reframe crying for me. I'm Catholic. And he said that in the Catholic tradition, in the early Desert Father tradition, they considered tears a spiritual gift. That there's a first baptism, but the tears are a second baptism, and that an ability, especially for a man, to kind of feel deeply is nothing to be ashamed of. It's a gift from God, and that and what I found in doing this work is nobody rarely remembers what I say. But especially as a man, if I'm willing to cry in public because I feel it so deeply, that's permission giving, right? I mean, it's okay for us to feel deeply. And I think we're so much in this kind of, I love Richard Rohr, and he talks about the fixing mode versus the weeping mode. And the fixing mode is I'm going to come in and fix everybody. But the reality is so much of life is so much bigger than we are. And all we can really do is weep. And that somehow our tears soften our hearts and allow different things to happen that we don't control. I mean, it's all so big, but we can show up as full human beings, and the willingness to be vulnerable is important. And the gifts of compassion that I've received, it really moved me. I mean, I think about it. I'm like, I've done so very little, and I receive so much. And I want other people to feel invited to receive as much as I've received.
So you remind me of two things, and I don't know who said it, but I have had ever since in my early teens a postcard that says, "Tears are the anti-soul of are the antifreeze of the soul." And I really very appreciate that. And I think, too, that we're talking on something very important, which is also one of the things that comes up a lot in the women and girls sector in particular, which is about balancing the feminine and the masculine. And, earlier in this call, we've talked about all of the divisions in society, and that when we can actually come together, there's a huge theme in that about becoming a whole person, because as we allow ourselves to become more whole, it inevitably spreads into our communities, and to not disassociate our hearts from our minds, and to use that as an opportunity to transform fear into care and compassion. And I think it's Brene Brown. I heard her speaking about her newest book, and one of the things that she talked about was vulnerability being like the undergirding for shame. And she, even in interviewing military, where people think, so courageous and not feeling, that actually the greatest military experiences came out of somebody taking the risk to be vulnerable. So I just reflect that back to you. And so one of the questions, there's still other questions, but there is one more thread that I'd like to follow up with you on. And I don't know if you can speak to this or not, but when a corporation, for example, like a large oil and gas company, because there have been a few comments about that, but I don't want to get into naming names here, or a large water company is trying to, make their profits and make their bottom line dollars happy to the point that they will lie or misrepresent themselves. Like how do grassroots organizers, how do city council people engage with the quote unquote enemy who gives false news and propaganda? Like how do you work with that? And what has your experience been with that?
That's not been, I think we're all called differently. And I recognize that people who work against those sorts of things have a calling and have a temperament and are doing what the universe wants them to do and is part of the big system. Mm-hmm. That's not been my calling. I mean, my calling has been kind of, people have described me as like the Shambhalaya warrior, where I'm going to be able to wear the suit and look friendly to a lot of the institutions when really I'm trying to dismantle and help build something different and help change the people that I interact with from the inside out, as opposed to me using energy against them. Now, that I have to be very careful in how I talk about that, because everyone has a calling, and in people who are living out that calling, it's very important that they do it. But I can only be one place at a time, and I can only do what I think I'm supposed to be doing. And what I think I'm supposed to be doing is, helping to create a justice system that doesn't label and ostracize people, but that holds people accountable in a loving, compassionate way, or to help create businesses that don't just measure financial return, but look at ratio between highest and lowest paid employee and look at their impact on the community and help them change from the inside out. So that's what I'm doing. And I can't kind of speak to the other part, because quite frankly, for me personally, my day job is I'm an employment attorney, and I fight other people all the time for a living. And I see that often in my day job, if I strike, the other person doesn't say you're right and I'm wrong. They strike back. And so, Thomas Merton, I think, said, be careful what you hate, because you become what you hate. And I think there can be a calling to fight against things. Mm-hmm. And I guess my only comment would be, don't hate the people you're fighting against. Love your enemy and bless those that persecute you, and help them see themselves for what they are so they can change. But it's not, I don't have not worked that way.
It's a really tough one. Like, what does a compassionate warrior look like?
Yeah.
And you remind me, because my background is or my educational background and some of my experiences is around counterterrorism. And I remember saying being at a conference and saying something along the lines of, look, we can choose love and care and compassion. In fact, we actually need the courage to start bringing these words into our policy. And in fact, even Alex Borain, who was one of the founders of the Center for Transitional Justice, spoke, and he said, we have to say love. We have to use that word, because otherwise we will never move forward. And I use that, then going back to counterterrorism, when, it doesn't mean that you don't imprison your enemy. If somebody is creating a societal harm, you don't let them run around with guns and killing random people, but you don't have to hate them and make them terrible and wrong, etc. I mean, of course, their behavior is wrong, but you can, instead of saying, screw you, we hate you, and off to prison with you, you can instead say, thank you. Thank you for showing us who we do not want to be. And as a result, your behavior has consequences. Then those consequences mean either you're imprisoned or whatever they are. There's a rehabilitation story, or maybe some people not. But it is really about creating a shift of consciousness from how we take our actions.
And I think really trying to love well is not black and white and is not simple. I mean, an example I like to give is, if an alcoholic is screaming for a drink and you give it to him, if you really loved him well. I mean, love is a right hand and a left hand, and it's not always, the perception is that it's always soft and easy, but it takes an awful lot of discernment. And an example I like to give, because people often think you need to be consistent and things are black and white. An example I like to give is that, Jesus, after the resurrection, went to Thomas and made Thomas stick his finger in him. And he went to Mary and said, "Don't touch me," because Mary needed something different and Thomas needed something different. And so learning, growing in love and developing skills in love and practices in love and compassion is not a one-off. It's a constant struggle. And what I've come to see is the people that really charge me out in the world, that really cause me a lot of pain, that person lives within me. I mean, all of the people that I dislike in the world, all of the people that are doing wrong things live within me. They do. I've got that capacity within me, and it's easy for me to deny that. It's easier for me to see it in them than to see it in myself. So the compassion path is about helping the world, but it's a bridge between internal practice and external change. As I change and grow, then I have more ability to love better other people, and that's my little part of it. And I'm called only to be Tom and only to remove obstacles. I'm not called to be somebody else, and I shouldn't weigh in on their calling. They're following their path. We may bump up against each other, and we have to work things out. But again, that's just how I approach things, or try to approach things.
Got it. Well, that's a really important thing. I'm just aware of time a little bit, that we've got about 10 minutes left. And so there's a few more topics that I'm going to sort of shift us over to, which is more about becoming a compassionate city. And you've mentioned, and we've mentioned on other calls too, that for becoming a compassionate city, on the Charter for Compassion website, there's a whole toolbox. And so that people can learn from. And so I think that can we speak a little bit about establishing a compassionate city from from both the grassroots side? How does somebody who's watching this call that wants to start a grassroots city, what kind of actions do they take? So from that level, but also if a mayor comes to you, that's going to be a different conversation, I would imagine. Can you speak about that?
Yeah, well, and on the point of the mayor, Louisville was named most livable large city at the Conference of Mayors because of the volunteer effort that Mayor Fischer spoke about. And, and this volunteer initiative is high impact with lower work for cities. So what we've tended to do when you have a potential mayor that's interested is we've just tried to connect them with Mayor Fischer. I mean, Mayor Fischer has been willing to talk to other mayors, either write them letters of encouragement or if he can work out communications, because mayors have different sets of concerns than the rest of us. And, Mayor Fischer is going to be more credible speaking to another mayor than I am. I don't know what it's like to be a mayor. So that Mayor Fisher's been very generous in his very limited time with that, because he believes in us and he recognizes like I do that if Louisville is successful and not the whole network is successful, we're not successful. So he's been very helpful in communicating with other mayors. And I think you can point to mayors to, hopefully not a political endeavor that's going to be challenging for you, but, maybe some attract some business, et cetera, et cetera. From the grassroots organization piece, we've really talked to cities and seen cities, find people who are passionate about this and start a conversation about it. We have an open space conversation that's been developed on compassion, and we have some leaders here locally that have talked to other cities and that can help with that. And so it's really been, you start small and start to have conversations, and you research it and you look at the Charter for Compassion group, a website that has the toolbox. We've worked more organically than some other cities, but the toolbox is a very disciplined approach. You can evaluate where the needs are in the community, and you can start to pick which particular needs you want to follow up with. But it made me think my biggest suggestion is, if you want to start in a community, get a mentor, connect up with some other cities. there's so many cities that are very mature in this right now and are doing some fabulous things. And I think, Maryland and the folks at the charter can connect you up with those cities. So have a conversation with some people but then make it authentic. I mean, Nashville's a lot about music and art, which makes sense in Nashville. We've got a different flavor here because we're a different city. So don't feel like you need to trust your own instincts on it as well. Mm-hmm. And don't be intimidated by the fact that it's way too big, because it is way too big. You just kind of got to start and build it. Like I indicated, I've had 2 conversations in Lexington, Kentucky, and they've been working at it for a couple of years. Mm-hmm. And this Thursday, their Metro Council is going to commit to it because, timing's everything. Sometimes things aren't ready. And if you're kind of staying at it when the time's right, you'll be ready to help with it.
Okay. That's perfect. So we have, I think, just like 2 minutes left or something like that. And so I ask you kind of one last time, given the transgression, or not transgression, the shift of our conversations, anything really on your heart that you'd like to conclude this conversation with?
Well, yeah, I think just that there's a lot of reasons to hope. Being part of this has really been just such a blessing, because there's this whole other world of people who are really amazingly loving and that really resonate with this, and that if you put out the signals, you'll start to connect with them. And I kind of joke that all of this has been the cheapest therapy that I've had, and it has been. I mean, it's been, you go out to give, but you'll find, and everyone who's listening to this knows this, you receive more than you give. Mm-hmm. And it's very challenging and humbling, and you die 1,000 deaths and you're reborn again. I mean, it's worth it. And maybe I can think of this story. I read a Margaret Wheatley book where she talked about a leader of the abolitionist movement in the United States. And she had him at a point in time in the 1850s where he had just spoken about the issue and had been beaten up and had no help anywhere. And it seemed absolutely impossible. I mean, she was talking, she painted the picture of this particular individual who was working on it and how it was completely bleak and there was no rational reason for him to do anything with it. And then, how 15 years later, he got to witness the end of the Civil War, and he was there when, the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, and how when he was doing what he was doing, there was no reason for him to do any of it, but he stuck with it and had an opportunity to see tremendous change in a short amount of time. And I'm not saying that any of us will necessarily live to see any of the fruits of this, but like I said, I mean, I think we planted a little oak tree here and we're all protecting its roots. And I think, maybe 100 years from now, people will be happy for us that there's a mayor who gets started in this, that there's a lawyer who's dumb enough to think this is worthwhile, that there's, so I think, we're all at this for a reason and we all have a bigger calling. And if we all just do our little part, this thing will grow. So I think that's what's on my heart is don't lose faith.
You remind me. Thank you for that. Yeah, when I was growing up, I was taught you're either part of the problem or part of the solution. And really what I hear you talking about is just be part of the solution. Walk the path of compassion. Even if you fall down, you will get up and the fruits of it will reflect to you both on the micro and the macro level. So
yeah. Amen.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your time and vulnerability and courage today, Tom. I'm really grateful to you. Thank you. And for everyone who's been with us here today, thank you so much for being with us. And we will see you hopefully. Actually, we have a shift in our schedule. Our next reaction to response call will be next Wednesday, October 18th, 8 in the morning. And we'll be having Krita Bansal join us. And she has worked at the intersection of top-level U.S. government, policy, compassion, academia, and global business. So I hope you all can join us then. And as for now, thank you again so much, Tom. And this call will be posted on the Charter for Compassion Reaction to Response website in the next day or so. And everyone who's registered, you'll also receive a copy through email, as well as some information from the chat sections. So thank you so much, everyone. Have a good rest of the day. Be compassionate. Do a job. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.